Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. Episode 114, Mary Hallett. Acknowledgement to Don Bradmore, who wrote the story on Mary Hallett for the Female Convict Research Centre Incorporated in 2020. The centre is an amazing source of female convict information, and they've given me permission to reference information to help create this episode. Mary Hallett was born in Surrey, England in about 1776. She was the daughter of Henry Mallet and Mary Fitzgerald, and she was the oldest of 6 children. On the 1st of June 1797, Mary married Abraham Martin, who 4 years later was appointed a surgeon in the Royal Navy. As England was at war with France at this time, it is likely that Abraham was at sea for lengthy periods throughout the marriage. While he was away, Mary seems to have lived in lodgings in London with her younger sister Maria. It may have been during one of Abraham's absences that Mary, her sister Maria, and a male acquaintance, Samuel Lamb, were charged with the theft of £22 in banknotes, 4 rings, an opera glass and several other trinkets from the London home of Mary Ann Cook. In the London newspaper The Globe on the 5th of April 1809, Maria Hallett, Mary Martin and Samuel Lamb were charged with feloniously stealing banknotes to the amount of £22, several articles of plates, trinkets and jewellery to a considerable amount, the property of Miss Cook of York Place, Lambeth. It appears that the prisoner Hallett was employed by the prosecutrix as a charwoman, and a few days since the property was stolen, at the time the prisoner was at work there. The street door was left open under a pretence that some person, having gained admittance, had made off with the property. Hallett denied all knowledge of any person having been admitted. The prosecutrix applied to Adkins, the officer, who, having no doubt that Hallett had been concerned in the robbery, went in pursuit of her, but found that she had suddenly removed, with the prisoner Mary Martin, her sister, who had cohabitated with the prisoner Lamb. Adkins learnt that Lamb was a steward of L'Aimable, lying at Sheerness, and he went there in pursuit of him, but he was not there. Adkins at length traced them to a house in 3 Kings Lane, Hammersmith, which they had but a few days taken possession of. He searched them and the house, but could not find any of the property. But going into the garden, he observed some earth that had lately been dug up. He set to work and turned it up, and after digging about 2 feet deep, he found the whole of the property, except the banknotes, wrapped up in a cloth and put into a basket. They were all committed for trial at the next assizes at the county of Surrey. In the Morning Advertiser on the 12th of August 1809 at Croydon. The assizes for this county of Surrey commenced at this town yesterday before the Lord Chief Baron. Samuel Lamb, Mary Martin and Mary Hallett were indicted. Miss Cook deposed that she kept several articles which were stolen in a small cabinet box, and they were in the box in the parlour of her mother's house on the evening of the 7th of March. The next day she missed the box and the articles it contained. She suspected some other persons and applied to Bow Street, but they did not think her suspicions sufficiently well founded and refused to grant her a warrant. The prisoner, Mary Martin, was the wife of a naval surgeon, and she'd known her for many years. The other female prisoner was her sister, and the man had lately returned from sea and lodged in the house with the 2 other prisoners. The next day the prisoners left their house at Lambeth and went, as she afterwards discovered, to North End, Fulham. She heard no more of her property for 9 or 10 days. At last she heard the box, which was a remarkable one, was exposed to sale at a broker's in Wych Street, St Clement's. She went there and learned that it had been sold by a man and a woman answering the description of the man prisoner and Mary Martin. She then traced them to Hammersmith, where they had gone, and accompanied by Adkins, an officer, they searched the house. She found part of an earring which she knew to be hers, upon which Mary Martin confessed she'd taken the box and said part of the things were buried in a little basket in the garden. They accordingly dug in the garden and found the basket with several of the stolen articles as she had described. The finding of the goods was corroborated by the witness, who accompanied Miss and the broker said he bought the box, which was a cabinet one of ivory, of a man, but he could not speak distinctly to his person. He came to him and said that, as he understood, he dealt in antiquities and curiosities, and he had brought him that box. The prisoner confessed she'd taken the box, but stated her fellow prisoners were entirely innocent. The jury found her guilty and acquitted the others. A death sentence was recorded against her, but it was later commuted to transportation for life. On the 23rd of March 1810, Mary left England aboard the Canada and arrived at Port Jackson on the 8th of September. She was about 33 years old at this time, and she brought an infant son, William Joseph Martin, with her. There is no record of the boy's birth. It is believed that he was born while Mary was awaiting transportation. He must have been born by the end of December of 1809. Her son was aged 31 when he died in October 1840, which is consistent with him being born in the latter part of 1809. Abraham Martin had already been married about 11 years and had no other children. He wasn't mentioned in the newspaper reports, so was probably at sea during that time. This was in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, and being a surgeon for the British Royal Navy, Abraham would not have had much free time. Samuel Lamb was recorded as cohabiting with Mary, according to the newspaper, and they were said to have moved in together once they moved from Lambeth to Hammersmith, so it's likely that William's father was in fact Samuel Lamb. A convict muster of New South Wales 4 years later lists Mary as a schoolmistress at Toongabbie, about 11 miles west of Parramatta. There she had impressed Reverend Samuel Marsden so much, the resident chaplain of the district and the person in charge of education in that colony, that when she requested permission in mid-1815 to go to Hobart to assist Thomas Fitzgerald, the government schoolmaster, he strongly supported her application. It is possible that Marsden, who also had responsibility for education in Van Diemen's Land, had suggested the idea to Mary, as there is no record of her having met Fitzgerald in New South Wales. Governor Lachlan Macquarie sent a message to Davey in Tasmania, which says, "A convict woman named Mary Martin, strongly recommended by Mr. Marsden, now proceeds to the Derwent in the Emu at her own request to be employed there as a schoolmistress, for which I believe her to be very fit, and therefore recommend that she may be employed in that capacity in Hobart Town." Mary arrived at Hobart aboard the Emu on the 30th of July 1815, accompanied by her son William, who was now 6. Interestingly, Mary and Thomas Fitzgerald married only 2 weeks later. It was not Thomas Fitzgerald's first marriage. In March 1801, he'd married Betty Ann Chilton at Westminster in London, and their son Henry was born in July 1801. While Thomas was never to see Chilton again after his transportation, his son was able to join him in Van Diemen's Land 21 years later. Thomas had arrived in Van Diemen's Land in January 1804. He was 27, and 2 years earlier he'd been convicted of embezzlement from his employers and sentenced for transportation for 7 years. He had been one of the 300 convicts in the party led by Captain David Collins in 1802, who'd been charged with establishing a settlement on Port Phillip. However, when that settlement at Sorrento, about 100 kilometres south of present-day Melbourne, had failed after a few months, Collins had been given approval to move his party across Bass Strait to a site on the Derwent which later became Hobart Town. There, Thomas was made a magistrate's clerk, but was also conducting evening classes for young men at his home in Davey Street, Hobart Town. In June 1812, he was appointed government schoolmaster on a salary of £10 a year. By 1815, this had been increased to £25 in remuneration, also for his services as a clerk. Mary, now Mary Fitzgerald, began teaching with her husband soon after their marriage and was immediately successful. Together they taught reading, writing, spelling, figures, grammar, geography, and perhaps history at their home. The girls were also taught sewing and needlework. For this, the Fitzgeralds received fees from parents. According to evidence given by Reverend Knopwood before the Big Commission in 1820, Thomas was appointed as a schoolmaster at Hobart in 1807, but being addicted to overindulgence in spirituous liquors, was dismissed from that office in about 1814, although strangely enough he was allowed to continue as a clerk. In June 1817, Sorrell dismissed Thomas from his position of magistrate's clerk, claiming to have received repeated complaints of his drunkenness and neglect, his absence continuing for several days. He was, however, allowed to remain a schoolmaster, and his school continued to flourish. In 1818, Mary applied to Lieutenant Governor Sorrell for a salary, and he recommended this be paid, telling Governor Macquarie at Sydney that she pays much attention to the female scholars. In 1819, she received a salary of £3 15 shillings per quarter. Although Mary was not the first female teacher in Van Diemen's Land, she appears to have been the first to be paid a salary by the government. An official report in 1820 shows that Thomas had 35 scholars and Mary had 24. In that same year, the Superintendent of Schools, Peter Mulgrave, informed Sorrell that he was pleasantly surprised to find that the foundations of education in the colony had been so well laid and widely extended. He reported that of the 236 children aged between 4 and 17 in Hobart Town, 200 had received some education, many of them by the Fitzgeralds. For the next few years all went well with the Fitzgeralds. Thomas was widely regarded as the foremost schoolmaster in Hobart, and the school he and his wife ran, while expensive, was also considered to be the best. Thomas was also supplying the government store with grain and meat, produced on land that he leased at the Black Snake, about 10 miles north of Hobart. There he was leasing 200 acres on which he ran sheep and cattle. 2 convict labourers had been allocated to him to tend the property. In December of the previous year, Henry, the infant son that Thomas had to leave behind when he was transported, arrived in the colony as a free settler. To help him get started, Thomas purchased a dilapidated house close to his Black Snake property. His intention was to convert the house, Addington Lodge, to an inn in which his son would manage while he himself continued with his teaching and farming interests. However, on the 5th of September, just weeks before the inn was due to open, Thomas died. In July 1935, a detailed history of Addington Lodge was written, and it said the old house was built by Governor Sorrell about 1820 for use for quiet weekends and holidays. He named it after Mr. G. H. Addington, at that time Secretary to the British Treasury, and with whom he had some dealings. In the Hobart Town Gazette on the 22nd of October 1824, it states that Addington Lodge, a villa residence 4 miles from the Black Snake on the New Norfolk Road, has been opened as an inn called the Golden Fleece by Henry Thomas Fitzgerald. And in the Hobart Town Gazette and Van Diemen's Land Advertiser, the Golden Fleece, New Norfolk Road, above the Black Snake. Henry Thomas Fitzgerald most respectfully begs leave to acquaint his friends and the public that he has opened an inn for the reception of travellers at that delightful villa known by the name of Addington Lodge, about 4 miles above the old Black Snake public house on the New Norfolk Road, where he hopes, by every attention to the comfort and accommodation of travellers, to meet with that encouragement he will be most studious to deserve, good stabling and a constant supply of choice of wines and spirits. And 4 days prior to that advertisement, it says the following persons were licensed to retail spirits, wine and beer, H.T. Fitzgerald, Golden Fleece at Glenorchy. Unfortunately, the Golden Fleece had an evil reputation, and that the name was truly descriptive of the fleecing accomplished within its walls and the golden results which accrued by the enterprising landlord. In the Colonial Times and Tasmanian Advertiser on the 16th of June 1826, it says Addington Lodge to be let and immediate possession given, the above most delightful estate containing 200 acres, situated on the banks of the river at the Black Snake, formerly in the occupation of Mr. Spode. The situation is remarkably well adapted for public business, being on the high road from Hobart Town to that increasingly flourishing settlement New Norfolk. For further particulars, apply to Mr. Wilson Campbell Street near the New Bridge. On the 22nd of April 1824, Mary received her certificate of freedom. However, upon her husband's death, she was unable to keep the school going. She struggled financially, and even though her husband left her everything in his will, significant debts had accumulated prior to his death, some of which might have been associated with the renovation of Addington Lodge, and it forced her to sell the Davy Street home early in 1825. Mary ran ads to sell her house 3 weeks in a row, in the Hobart Town Gazette and Van Diemen's Land Advertiser from the 8th of April 1825, and the ad said, "To be sold, a good family house situated in Davies Street fronting the harbour. It contains 2 front parlours, 2 bedrooms and a kitchen with a small house detached and a fine garden." She then ran a more detailed advertisement in the Hobart Town Gazette on the 20th of August 1825. "To be sold, a good family house situated in Davies Street fronting the harbour, containing 2 front parlours, 2 bedrooms and a kitchen, with a small house detached, formerly used as a school, and a fine garden well stocked with fruit trees, now in the occupation of Mr. Underwood, auctioneer." Mary ran the ad again in the December in the Colonial Times and Tasmanian Advertiser with further modifications, and by then she has moved to Goulburn Street. Hoping to improve her financial situation, she applied successfully for a licence to sell wine, spirits and beer. Her new premises was known as the Mermaid. Within a matter of months, however, she realised that running an enterprise of that kind was beyond her, and she abandoned the business. The house still had not sold, and in February 1826, in the Hobart Town Gazette, Mary faced further impediments. The sale did not go smoothly. The problem was that a man by the name of Philip Mills claimed to hold a mortgage of £200 on the property. Mary disputed this amount, claiming the mortgage to be only £100. So an ad in the paper says, "Caution, proposals have been made by Mary Agnes Fitzgerald to several persons for the sale of her house and premises situated in Davies Street, Hobart Town. The undersigned deems it proper to caution the public against purchasing the same, as he holds a mortgage on the said house and premises for securing payment of the sum of £200. Philip Mills." This seems like a strange thing to do, because surely when she sold the house, then Mary would be able to repay her debt to him. So Mary countered with her own declarations in the Hobart Town Gazette on the 26th of February 1826. "To the public, the undersigned begs to state that the advertisement signed Philip Mills, which appeared in the Hobart Town Gazette of the last and 2 preceding weeks, cautioning the public against purchasing her premises, as he held a mortgage on the same for securing payment of the sum of £200, is false and unfounded. Mary Agnes Fitzgerald." On the 4th of March in the Hobart Town Gazette, she put another advertisement in the paper. "Whereas Philip Mills has most wickedly and maliciously cautioned the public of Van Diemen's Land and its vicinity against purchasing the premises belonging to the undersigned, situated in Davies Street, Hobart Town, to her very great injury, now she begs to state that the mortgage he holds is for only £100, £50 of which goods were received for not worth £20, and a premium of 8%, charged for a loan of the remaining £50 for 9 months, the date of which does not expire until June 1826. Mary Agnes Fitzgerald." Philip Mills took Mary to court, perhaps because she was not maintaining payments on her mortgage, and that is outlined in the Hobart Town Gazette on the 12th of August 1826. Mills versus Fitzgerald. "On Saturday the 19th of August at 12 o'clock, the Sheriff will cause to be put up for sale on the premises in Davies Street, Hobart Town, near the Naval Office, an excellent house, partly brick-built and partly weatherboarded, the property of the above defendant, unless this execution be previously satisfied." So it is likely that Mary did not benefit in any significant way from the sale of the house. And it appears that a Mr. Patterson had dissolved his business partnership and he was using Mary's house as his base. As on the 14th of October 1825, in the Colonial Times and Tasmanian Advertiser, it says partnership dissolved. The co-partnership existing between the undersigned under the firm of Dawes and Patterson this day is dissolved by mutual consent. They will in the future carry on business separately, Mr. Dawes at his house in Macquarie Street and Mr. Patterson at the house of Mrs. Fitzgerald in Davies Street, lately occupied by Mr. Underwood. In January 1826, Mary wrote to Lieutenant Governor George Arthur, who had replaced Sorrell in 1824, telling him that her health was deteriorating and pleaded for his help. She told him that she feared for the welfare of her children in the event of her death. In particular, she requested a grant of land for William Joseph, her son, now aged 17. No record of Arthur's reply has been found, and no land ever seems to have been granted to her children. Financial pressures were not the only concern for Mary. In late 1825, she wrote to Magistrate James Scott, telling him that she was receiving unwanted attention from a man by the name of Kirby. She assured Scott that she had done nothing to encourage Kirby's overtures. As she heard no more from Kirby after this, it is likely that Scott took action to deter him from further annoyance. However, Mary's financial circumstances were soon to worsen dramatically. On the 25th of September 1826, Henry, Thomas's 25-year-old son, was drowned in a boating accident on the Derwent. Shortly after arriving in Van Diemen's Land, he had married, and Mary, who still had 2 young children of her own at home, Matilda, who was born in 1817, and Thomas, born 1818, was obliged to take in Henry's young widow, Harriet, who was Harriet Downey, and her 2 infants. During the next couple of years, with so many people to support, Mary tried to re-establish herself as a schoolmistress. On the 24th of November 1826, she advertised in Hobart newspapers that she was about to open a day school. Unfortunately, the attempt was unsuccessful. In late December 1829, now 53, Mary remarried. Her new husband was William Nichols, and she married him at St David's at Clarence Plains. William was a cabinet maker and a farmer who was in his mid to late 60s. Nichols, like Thomas Fitzgerald, had arrived in the colony with Collins' party in 1803, and he was a free settler rather than a convict. His wife and their children had accompanied him. In Van Diemen's Land, he was the superintendent of convicts, responsible for carpenters and builders. At first, the family did well there through land grants and building projects. Nichols was granted 100 acres at Newtown, but later the authorities resumed the land for other purposes. In 1813, Nichols moved his family to Clarence Plains, where Fanny died in 1823. By the time of his marriage to Mary, much of his wealth had been lost. Unfortunately, Mary's marriage to Nichols was to bring little joy to either of them. Within 12 months, both were imprisoned for non-payment of debts, which Mary had incurred before the marriage. And on the 7th of January 1831, Peters versus Nichols. Nichols and his wife had been both imprisoned for a debt contracted by the latter before her marriage with Mr. Nichols. Both husband and wife being utterly destitute of pecuniary means, they applied to Solicitor General Stephen, who most humanely moved the court gratuitously for the discharge of the poor woman who at an advanced period of life had been thus imprisoned, and for the usual prison allowance to Mr. Nichols. His Honour the Chief Justice ordered Mrs. Nichols to be discharged. Mr. Nichols was then examined by Mr. Ross, in answer to whose questions he stated that he sold his farm at Clarence Plains upwards of a year ago to Mr. Murray. He had no property whatsoever, except a few working tools to the value of £4. He was accordingly ordered to receive the prison allowance prayed for. Mary died on the 10th of July 1831 at the age of 55. She'd been unwell for some time, and she's buried at St Matthew's at Rockaby. Regrettably, her death certificate shows that her quality or profession is only a house builder's wife. Her descendants: Mary's child with Abraham Martin, William Joseph Martin. Well, he married Mary Ann Roberts on the 28th of June 1830 in Clarence Plains. They had 6 children, 4 who survived childhood, and William died on the 18th of October 1840 at Clarence Plains, aged only 31. His wife Mary Ann was born in England, and she married Cyrus Wood on the 14th of September 1841 at the schoolhouse at Clarence Plains. Cyrus was English and 4 years younger than Mary, and they had 3 children together. By 1853 they moved to Chiltern in Victoria and were living at Castlemaine in 1856, and Mary died at Tallangatta in Victoria on the 23rd of June 1876, aged 71. Their 4 surviving children: Louisa was born on the 8th of January 1833 at Clarence Plains, and she married Samuel Smart in Kyneton in Victoria in 1859 when she was 26. Louisa died at Tallangatta on the 4th of November 1918 at the age of 85, and her obituary notice states, Mrs. Louisa Smart died at Tallangatta on Saturday. The old lady was born at Clarence Plains, Tasmania. When 20 years of age, she came over to Victoria, and 5 years later was married at Kyneton. After some years' residence in Victoria, she accompanied her husband to New Zealand, where she resided for some years, and thereafter in New South Wales for a term. Her husband died in Sydney in 1887, A year later, Mrs. Smart came to Tallangatta and lived alongside her brother, Mr. Henry Martin, one of Tallangatta's pioneer settlers. She has resided here ever since. Mrs. Smart had no children, and she was greatly liked by all who knew her. She enjoyed remarkably good health until about a year ago, when signs of breaking up of the system became apparent. She had a bad turn about a month ago, but recovered. On Friday evening, Mrs. Smart was reading the war news to her brother Henry, who latterly had been residing in the same house. During the night, she was taken seriously ill and the doctor sent for. She had an acute attack of influenza. On Saturday afternoon, preparations were made to remove her to the local hospital. A car was at the door for the purpose, but just as she was about to be carried out to the car, the old lady collapsed and passed away peacefully a few minutes later. The cause of death was bronchopneumonia. As before stated, Mr. Henry Martin is a brother of the deceased, and Mr. James Wood of Georges Creek is a half-brother. Only a few days before her fatal illness, Mrs. Smart expressed a heartfelt wish to see again her grandnephew, Private Henry Peacock, who is serving in France and to whom she is deeply attached. She hoped it would not be long before he returned, as she had a premonition of her close impending end. So the second child was William Joseph Martin Jr. He was born on the 2nd of March 1835 at Clarence Plains, and he died at Tallangatta, Victoria, on the 14th of April 1898 at the age of 63. It says Mr. William Martin, an old Tallangatta identity, was last reported to be dying from abscess on the brain. The doctor gave it as his opinion that death might take place at any moment, although the sufferer might linger for days. Mr. Martin had been suffering from some weeks from an abscess on the head, but it was thought it was getting better, and he attended sports on Easter Monday. On Tuesday, he became worse. About 3 o'clock on Wednesday morning, he told his sister, Mrs. Smart, who was nursing him, that she might take a rest. Mrs. Smart went to sleep, and on waking up 3 hours later, she found that her brother had been raving while she slept. He was in a state of collapse and partly unconscious. Dr. Thwaites, who was out of town, was hurriedly recalled yesterday and found the sufferer to be beyond medical skill, the abscess having burst inwardly and induced incurable cerebral complications. The third child, George Edward Martin, was born on the 16th of January 1839 at Clarence Plains, and he died in Howlong, New South Wales, on the 3rd of January 1873, aged only 33. The fourth child, Henry Oswald Martin, was born on the 26th of March 1840 at Clarence Plains. He married Eliza Ann Brown, an Irish girl, at Chiltern, Victoria, on the 5th of August 1862. They had 8 children, 6 surviving infancy, these being the only descendants of Williams. Henry was a grazier, and the announcement of his death in 1927, Martin, on the 4th of August at Tallangatta, Henry Oswald Martin, relict of the late Anne Martin, loved father of William, Joseph, Mary, Catherine, Louisa, Elizabeth and Henry, in his 87th year, born at Clarence Plains, Tasmania, 26th of March 1840. Mary's children with Thomas Fitzgerald. Matilda Fitzgerald was born on the 4th of January 1817 in Hobart. She married John Orson Oldfield McArdle, a Canadian, at Clarence Plains in 1835 when she was 18. In 1851, it mentions that John McArdle had Rokeby School, a classical, mathematical and commercial school, and he had his school at Bayview. On the 27th of August 1881, there was a presentation to Mr. John McArdle, and it says, one of the most influential and jovial gatherings ever remembered at Kangaroo Point took place at the Institute of that district on Thursday evening. For some considerable time past, a movement has been on foot by old scholars and residents of Bellarive and surrounding districts to present Mr. McArdle, schoolmaster at Mornington, Cambridge Road, with a testimonial and purse of sovereigns. Mr. McArdle's long extended educational career with the district was referred to, saying that he had turned out useful members of society. Mr. McArdle had always displayed a lively interest in matters connected with the district, being twice elected member of the Roads Trust and councillor for Clarence, also greatly entreating himself in providing church services for the district. Mr. McArdle, who on rising was greeted with an ovation of applause, and he said, "Is with feeling of more than ordinary pleasure and universal satisfaction that I accept this public demonstration of your esteem and your highly flatteringly expressed appreciation of my poor endeavours as a teacher. Although my services for the lengthened period I have been engaged in tuition are overrated, Yet believe me, I am sincere when I tell you that I ever worked with a will and earnest desire to benefit those committed to my charge, and I will add to conduce in my humble way to the advancement of society in the land of my adoption, Tasmania. Mr. McCardle's scholastic principles, saying he earned himself the esteem and respect of all with whom he'd been brought into contact. And Matilda died on the 17th of November 1885 at Mornington, Tasmania, and she was 68. The third child, Thomas Fitzgerald, was born in Hobart on the 28th of December 1818. Thomas Fitzgerald's son, Henry Thomas Fitzgerald. Henry was born in July 1801 in London, and Henry arrived from England in January 1824. On the 4th of December 1824, Henry married Harriet Downey in Hobart. On the 4th of April 1825, their daughter Mary Ann was born in Hobart. By the 16th of June 1826, the inn was advertised to be let. Their second child, William Henry Fitzgerald, was born at New Norfolk on the 1st of July 1826. By the 25th of September 1826, Henry drowned after falling overboard from a boat, aged only 25, leaving Harriet with two infants, aged 18 months and 3 months. And a brief article outlined his death on the 29th of September 1826. On Monday last, as Mr. Henry Thomas Fitzgerald was coming down the river in a boat laden with dry bark, he accidentally fell overboard owing to a sudden squall and unfortunately drowned. The deceased leaves a wife and two infant children wholly unprovided for. Harriet went on to marry George Williams in Hobart in 1828, and she died at Gould's Country on the 14th of May 1890, aged 88. So after being convicted in England and coming out, Mary Hallett had such promising prospects in Tasmania, and unfortunately with the death of her husband and the financial woes that resulted, it didn't end up being a prosperous life that Mary would have hoped for. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.